Welcome back to episode 2 of Arcade Academia. I'm Emily Reuben.
And I'm Daley Wilhelm.
And we're two lifelong scholars finally using our journalism backgrounds and, I guess, our master's degrees to do something more than just write another gaming hot take. Arcade Academia isn't a gaming news podcast. Each episode is an exhaustively researched deep dive into scholarly examinations of video games. In this episode, we're exploring the concept of girl games. What differentiates a girl game from other video games? Are girl games a thing of the past? And what girl games are there today? We asked Ash Rezvani, an assistant professor of game design and interactive media at the University of Montana, to help us dissect this fascinating and sometimes controversial subject.
I have always been interested in serious games. So when I was working as a freelance game designer, I made a lot of educational games for kids, usually around K through 12. And I worked a lot with nonprofits to make games for like activism. So I've made games about the climate crisis, menstrual health, financial literacy, all kinds of fun things, structural racism. My interests in things related to games are pretty far ranging. So everything from like gender, which is what we're kind of talking about today, right? With girl games and in that context, to food in games. I wrote my master's dissertation on how food is treated and represented in games. So yeah, a lot of random things. I just recently finished a paper on RuneScape drop parties. So a little bit with party studies too, which is always a joy to read about and write about. And yeah, I'm really excited to keep working in sort of the sphere of gender in games. And I've been not just looking at constructions of femininity, but also masculinity, which I think has been traditionally left unexamined within game studies, at least to the extent when you compare to how we look at women and femininity, there's this overwhelming body of work. And then you look at masculinity and there's kind of a dearth of research in that area, although there's some really important scholars and work being made to contribute towards making that sort of on par with how we've looked at women.
We first became aware of Rezvani and her work through her article From Girl Talk to Girl Games, the Analog History of Games for Girls, which she wrote while she was a Valentine Cosman Research Fellow at the Strong National Museum of Play. In Rochester, she examined the museum's vast collection of 19th and 20th century board games.
So I started looking at these board games around 1850, right? And from 1850 until about the early 60s, board games were framed and marketed to the American public as something for the whole family. So you see depictions of men, women, children, everyone kind of gathered around like a carom board if you open a, Sears Roebuck catalog from, the late 1800s or something like that. And when you look at like the text on like Milton Bradley from the early 20s or something like that, you'll see like, this is fun for the whole family. This is everything from little sister to grandpa.
For much of history, gaming was a gender-neutral pastime. Board games, from Carom to Parcheesi, were meant to be enjoyed by anyone of any age. The first video games to hit the market were likewise advertised as something the whole family could enjoy. Atari ads featured families huddled in excitement around the living room television. A 1976 newspaper ad for Super Pong featured an illustration of a mother and daughter enjoying, quote, TV home fun games from Atari. But then something happened in the late 20th century. Following the video game crash of '83, demographic research examined who was buying games and found that young boys were the strongest consumer segment. Thus, marketing efforts doubled down on capturing their attention. Video games quickly shifted from family fun to the sole domain of older brother rather than little sister. The design and marketing of video games in the 80s and 90s made it clear that video games were for boys. These ads that steadily started to sexualize women as their young male audience matured began to create the perception that video games weren't for women. Video games for girls were few and far between, the exception rather than the rule. When they did appear on the market, they were undoubtedly a girl game.
Girl games, if you read a lot of academic literature on this topic, usually are referring to digital games that started emerging in the 1990s that had a few key characteristics. They have a lot of mechanics that are narrative focused rather than focusing on, say, violence. There's a lot of dress up mechanics. So not combat, it's more dating simulator. There's this sort of Barbie pink aesthetic with lots of sparkles and hearts and things that we generally associate with femininity in the 90s, right? And this is in many ways a controversial sort of genre of games. There's a lot of discourse around girl games, especially in the 90s and into the early aughts. But they're distinguished mostly by the fact that they're explicitly marketed to girls, right? And in the 80s and 90s, video games were considered to be a male leisure activity. And so the default assumption was that these are made for boys and men, and girl games are specifically designed to have a female audience or female players. And along with that, we get the dating mechanics, the dress-up mechanics, this sort of association or preoccupation with appearance.
Today, men and women play video games in approximately equal numbers, as reported by the Entertainment Software Association. There is far less stigma around the idea of women playing video games than there was in the past. This is why so many of the games most frequently cited as exemplary of a girl game are from the 1990s. That said, Rezvani tells us that girl games are alive and well in 2026.
So girl games still exist today, even though they kind of had their heyday, or in the 90s, at least within the digital sphere. And so I think that like you look at like Dress to Impress, which is a Roblox game that went viral the summer of 2024, or Infinity Nikki. These are some more recent examples of girl games that use the same mechanics and narrative and sort of aesthetic framing.
Are girl games defined by the lovely pink aesthetic, by dress-up game mechanics? Stepping out of the 90s, how do we define a girl game? In her 2017 book, Ready Player 2, Women Gamers and Designed Identity, University of Georgia professor of entertainment and media studies Shira Chess proposed a rubric for whether or not a game was designed with a female player base in mind. The rubric, practically expressed as a chart that we have included in the accompanying article to this episode, considers 10 factors: thematic congruence, collaborative/social, time positive, low risk, creative expression, lush aesthetics, non-sexualized characters, avatar choice, low violence, and low harassment potential. It is more likely that a game has considered a potentially female player base if, for example, the game allows for diverse choice in the player's avatar, if the game is social but regulated so that harassment in chat is impossible, and if the game does not demand large swaths of time for a play session. Games like Candy Crush or Animal Crossing therefore rank more highly as a girl game than Grand Theft Auto or League of Legends. Chess writes, in a way, it becomes apparent that several of the factors listed as attributes are not mapping only theorized masculine-feminine play expectations, they are also mapping whether a game is casual. But before we delve into current casual offerings that appeal to girls and women, let's do our homework on the history of the successes, failures, and controversies of 1990s girl games.
However, at the same time, as these sort of very market-focused girl games were coming out, there was Purple Moon Interactive and The Learning Company coming out. And these were companies like Purple Moon, for example. I think her name is Brenda Laurel, and she, was wanting to create more games for girls. But if you look at like some of the earlier titles from Purple Moon, like Rockette, these are largely narrative-focused games, and they have some of the similar themes that you see in girl games otherwise, like kind of this preoccupation with appearance, more to do with relationships and narrative than, say, like strategic combat or things like that. And she, to my knowledge, kind of did some market research on like what do girls prefer in terms of their game experiences as she was designing her games. But we also need to acknowledge that we don't know what girls like just independently or what they're told they're like through advertising and through sort of strict gender expectations that are thrust upon them. And so we suddenly see this rise in the 90s, right, of all these titles from both Mattel, Sega, the Purple Moon, the Learning Company, right, which did the American Girl series. And it's proving that there is a market for these games amongst girls.
In her article, Party Like It's 1995, The Rise and Fall of the Girl Game, Al Rosenberg explores the rise of girl games during the 90s. Rosenberg asserts that the surge began once companies realized that they were missing out on girls as a potential target demographic, which explains why girl games during this era were almost exclusively released on CD-ROM. Consoles were marketed primarily to boys, but by contrast, more and more homes had a family computer. Companies targeting girls could take advantage of access to girls through a family computer without needing to convince their parents to buy an entirely new system. This rise in tech marketed to women is further explored in the book From Barbie to Mortal Kombat: Gender and Computer Games. The book explains that the growing sentiment during the 90s was that, quote, girls, no less than boys, need computers at an early age so that they are going to be adequately prepared to get good jobs for good wages. And so, women-led developers like Her Interactive, Girl Tech, and Purple Moon Games hit the scene in the late 90s, creating games that were available and accessible for young girls. Everything changed when Barbie Fashion Designer exploded onto the scene in 1996. While Mattel had previously released Barbie titles like Barbie or Barbie Supermodel on the NES or Barbie Vacation Adventure on the SNES, these games really failed to find their audience. However, Barbie Fashion Designer for the PC was released to huge commercial success, selling more than 500,000 copies in its first 2 months, and earning more than $14 million by the end of 1996, according to an article from Harper's Bazaar. Barbie Fashion Designer was the first girl game to achieve commercial success, and thus became the catalyst for the girl games movement during the 90s. But what made Barbie Fashion Designer a success where other previous titles failed? Early attempts to market video games to girls were rather simplistic. The popular idea during the 80s and 90s was that if developers just plop a female protagonist into a game, girls would eat it up. But this isn't necessarily true. There are many factors that can make a game appealing to girls beyond the inclusion of a female protagonist. In From Barbie to Mortal Kombat, researchers identify key differences between male and female gamers during the period when Barbie Fashion Designer was released. The authors note that in popular culture, mystery genre staples like Nancy Drew and the Boxcar Children were popular among girls in elementary school because they often featured domestic settings, characters, and female protagonists. When looking at video games, a similar trend remained true. The authors note that games with more interpersonal, gentler gameplay are more likely to attract girls, stating that, quote, girl games do not need to be devoid of action, but the mystery or action component in girls' games must be non-violent and allow players to solve problems or mysteries and arrive at solutions by relating to and cooperating with others. When looking at popular games at the time, such as Doom or Duke Nukem, violence was largely embedded in mainstream video games. The 1999 study, contextualizing video game violence from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1 to Mortal Kombat 2, suggests that, quote, because the game industry equates violence with action, games targeted for girls automatically lack any action, violent or not. In Barbie Fashion Designer, the minimal action or player input required is completely removed from any form of violence. The gameplay revolves around designing clothes and outfits for Barbie and has a practical, real-world application. You can print these design patterns to create actual clothing for Barbie dolls, reinforcing the idea that practicality and productivity are key components in crafting games for girls. Another key reason Barbie Fashion Designer was such a success is the difference in gameplay styles between girls and boys. Patricia Marks Greenfield asserts in their 1996 study, Mind and Media, The Effects of Television, Video Games, and Computers, that males tend to adopt a more experimental, trial-and-error approach and are likely to learn by, quote, acting before understanding all the rules and patterns of the game. On the contrary, girls prefer games with predictability, patterns, and clear rules. In Barbie Fashion Designer, there are no bullets or puzzles. Instead, there are clear menus and icons with no twists or turns along the way. Though Barbie Fashion Designer lacks any grand mystery or collaborative element, it shines by connecting players to the real world, functioning as an accessory for the Barbie doll. The authors of From Barbie to Mortal Kombat suggest that a major factor in determining whether girls will engage with a game is whether the game interfaces with the reality of players' lives or parallels the situations and relationships one may encounter in reality. The indie studio Purple Moon Games, founded by Brenda Laurel, played a huge role in defining girl games of the time. Laurel understood the importance of familiarizing girls with modern technology, citing the primary reason for forming Purple Moon in an interview with the National Endowment for the Arts. In her own words, she stated that the goal was to, quote, design games that would get girls' hands on the computer and gain some comfort and facility with the technology. In her field manual, Utopian Entrepreneur, Laurel further expands on the importance of providing games for girls, stating that she wanted to, quote, create an industry that listened to little girls, nurturing and engaging young women to address their social, cultural, and narrative proclivities. But to do this, Purple Moon needed to shatter the perception that girls don't like video games, and therefore don't want to play them. In the Endowment of the Arts interview, Laurel stated the following, quote, "The origin of the video game industry was really vertically integrated. It was games made for young men, by young men, sold to young men, in places where young men went, such as retail outlets that were pretty gender exclusive." Laurel also noted that the failure of a scrapped Activision Barbie game in 1987 helped cement the idea that games for girls were doomed to fail. She shared that, quote, "The designer of that game told me in an interview that the game mechanic was throwing marshmallows at the mall, because girls weren't very good at trajectory, and marshmallows moved more slowly. That game sank like a stone, and it reified the folklore about girls and games that had been there since the beginning." Clearly, there was plenty of work to be done to change not only the public perception of girls as gamers, but also how game developers viewed and marketed to young girls. As such, a 6-year, $40 million research study with backing from Interval Research, interviewing thousands of children between the ages of 7 and 12, was conducted to determine why girls weren't playing video games and how games can be made for them. According to Kotaku, the research was both qualitative and quantitative, asking questions about what made the girls feel insecure and how much television they watched. Using the information from the study, Purple Moon was established in 1996 and released its first CD-ROM title, Rocket's New School, followed by Secret Paths of the Forest only a year later. The games, described as friendship adventures for girls, were interactive visual novels that encouraged players to navigate a range of emotions and social situations. The two games were interconnected in that they shared characters and storylines, while focusing on character-driven narratives and a storytelling device Laurel refers to as, quote, emotional navigation. But sadly, despite the research that Purple Moon had conducted to create these titles, they did not perform as well as the company hoped. Purple Moon ultimately shuttered in 1999 and was bought by their competitor, Mattel. Purple Moon was no stranger to controversy. Though the developers' intentions were noble, some critics slammed the games, citing that the characters leaned into harmful gender and ethnic stereotypes. Many feminists also rejected the notion that girls couldn't like or engage with games that were presented as traditionally masculine. Additionally, the results of Purple Moon's 6-year-long research study was contentious, with some casting doubt on whether the study reflected the actual desires of girls.
There's also these controversies that arise because there's one camp that says, this is amazing. We shouldn't discount these games just because they are, steeped in femininity. If this is what girls like, that's fine. We shouldn't trivialize this or condescend to these girls for enjoying these kinds of mechanics. They're still quote unquote real games. And sort of in that camp too, they were discussing how important it was for girls to gain familiarity with technology, right? And computers, this idea that if they start earlier on learning how to use a computer, engaging with it through the lens of video game, then they might be more likely to pick up a career in engineering or computer science or something like that later on. So that was one side. And then the other side was like, well, actually, a lot of the content of these games is still quite patriarchal, right? It's still asking women to be preoccupied with their appearance, still a strong focus on dating and relationships rather than, say, independence or career. There were some games that talked about workplace, but for the most part, it was very much about dress up, right? And about relationships and things like that. And so there was this criticism from this other side of this debate being like, what is quote unquote a game for a girl? Why can't women engage with the games that are marketed to men? There was this idea that the games for girls or girl games had simplified mechanics. They weren't as mentally challenging. So they weren't giving them the same kinds of like intellectual stimulation that you would hope for, etc. And I find this debate interesting because I think that it's kind of like a microcosm of sort of the broader conversation in the 90s between equality feminism and like difference feminism, right? This idea of like men and women are equal, right? Which is equality feminism. And we should all have the same rights and all be treated the same way. And most of the differences between men and women are as a result of conditioning, right? Rather than something biological. And then you have difference feminism, which is saying, no, men and women are different. We still deserve similar rights, but like we need to acknowledge these differences and account for them. And so I think that girl games, like I said, girl games are kind of a microcosm of this debate within feminism more broadly at this time too. And the sort of discourse around girl games, to my knowledge, kind of tapers off into the aughts. That's not to say though that girl games are gone. Like girl games have been designed and produced and distributed to audiences ever since the 90s, whether it's a big title like Infinity Nikki or just, girlgames.com, and you get all the lovely like pink flash dress-up games on the browser that I think a lot of people, including myself, played as a youngin'.
As youngins, both Emily and I were inducted into the world of gaming primarily through Nintendo titles. This is no accident, but rather a direct result of the blue ocean marketing strategy that the Japanese company employed. Rather than compete with the likes of PlayStation and Xbox, which were the go-to choices of gaming's primary demographic, Nintendo waded out of the bloodied competitive market surrounding young men and pivoted to audiences that had not taken a side in the console war, nor really considered themselves to be gamers, girls and adult women.
You just reminded me about Nintendo in the early, what was it, the 80s, late 80s, when they unveiled the Nintendo knitting machine during the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and then it never really made it to, larger audiences. But even then, kind of like what you're saying is like that home console was presumed to be for boys, so they tried to feminize it, but apparently it didn't work out very well since it never hit retail. But then Nintendo, again, they made a similar machine that would plug into the Game Boy, now portable, and work out well. It did not. In the introduction to her book, Ready Player 2, Shira Chess contextualizes the Nintendo knitting machine for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The game, which never made it to market, was an attempt to target a female audience, which, as we discussed, is not something that was really done during the 80s when the Nintendo knitting machine was conceived. In 2012, Nintendo employee Howard Phillips posted an image of a planned advertisement for the Nintendo knitting machine with a headline reading, "Now you're knitting with power." The ad reads, "It's not a game, not a toy, and not something a young girl can outgrow in 3 or 6 months, or even a year. It's a machine that interacts with the powerful Nintendo Entertainment System to actually knit sweaters, and not just 1 or 2 patterns, but a multitude of different and unique ideas." So, how did this wacky idea come about? In her book, Chess describes what she refers to as the designed identity of women in gaming, or in her own words, the constructed identities suggested with game design, advertising, and narrative. When explaining how the designed identity of women is used in marketing, Chess explains that, quote, "Designed identity allows specific women to be a valid sales point for companies attempting to tap into the emerging female gamer demographic, but it also operates as a means of keeping that very demographic in stasis. An unchanging demographic has predictable consumer needs that are easy to satisfy." Chess suggests that the designed identity of the female gamer is a theoretical woman who is complementary to the designed white, cis, heterosexual, young, abled, and middle-class male player. Unlike her male counterpart, this hypothetical female gamer, who Chess defines as Player 2, is secondary, undervalued, and often dismissed in the game industry. Unlike the designed identity of male gamers, the female gamer identity is typically painted as a casual gamer, which of course carries a negative connotation. Chess notes that many of the games designed with Player 2 in mind also ignore intersectional politics and the lived realities of women's leisure. In short, this designed identity of women inherently places greater value on their male counterparts, Player 1, resulting in the trivialization and undervaluing of women as a target demographic in gaming. The Nintendo knitting machine was an absurd attempt to capture the female demographic, and it's easy to see how the implication that women only play games if they tie back to traditionally feminine activities like sewing can be insulting. However, there was research behind the endeavor that indicated girls may be more open to engaging with video games if gaming was tied to practical skills or productivity. In her book, Chess details how feminist leisure studies can be applied to the analysis of gendered marketing in video games. To summarize Chess's description of feminist leisure studies, it is a field that focuses on the relationship between adult women and leisure activities. It also tends to focus on leisure activities within the domestic sphere. Due to long-held societal norms, women often have less leisure time than men. This stems from the fact that women typically have more responsibilities in the home than men, meaning that they simply have less time to engage in hobbies and other relaxation practices. Chess points to studies showing that many women feel anxious about engaging in leisure activities, and as a result, they tend to pursue leisure that is productive or easily paused so they can handle any work responsibilities that may suddenly arise. When it comes to video games, a lack of time is cited as a major reason why many women don't play. They simply aren't seen by many as a productive use of their limited time, and game companies are privy to this distinction. Nintendo's marketing was not just blindly targeting an untapped market, the company was taking note of how women tie productivity to their leisure. Leisure was meant to be practical, or broken into small sections throughout the day, which could help to explain the scrapped Nintendo knitting machine. If Nintendo can make gaming seem productive, then maybe it can engage with girls and women. Though it never made it to the market, the Nintendo knitting machine is undoubtedly an interesting concept and showcases how Nintendo and game developers as a whole regard the underrepresented female demographic. And then later with the DS, their marketing was more of like, this is something you can put in your purse. So would you say Nintendo kind of leads that charge in terms of like, I know the DS isn't a console, just overall in all their platforms?
Yeah, I think that Nintendo historically has been a lot better about marketing to women than PlayStation or Xbox or even Atari, right, back in the day. And I think that that is also in part because of the titles that they release, right, on their console or handhelds or whatever it may be at a particular time. And I think that in some ways, too, it might, I don't know if this might be a chicken or an egg situation, but the fact of the matter is, too, is that when we look at computers, especially earlier on in the 90s or late 80s when they're really, really expensive, parents are far more likely to spend money on gifts for boys than for girls. And so it's a lot cheaper to buy a girl a handheld than, say, a PC capable of running a video game or a console that's capable of running a video game. And so perhaps Nintendo was aware of this, perhaps they weren't, and they just, like I said, this is a chicken and an egg situation, but I do think that, you know, these handhelds are definitely less of a financial barrier for most families to purchase than, say, a console or a PC, and they're definitely far more likely to buy a PC or a console for their son rather than their daughter. So that could also be contributing.
I don't like to hear that. I
know, it's awful. It's awful, yeah.
Nintendo remains to be known as being accessible for almost any type of player, regardless of gender. A recent study conducted in May 2024 by IP FanKit confirms this, indicating that nearly half of the Japanese Nintendo Switch player base was female. By contrast, the Switch's competitors were overwhelmingly owned and played by males, with 80% of PlayStation 4 and 5 players and 85% of PC players respectively. So how has Nintendo effectively captured the attention of female gamers? In short, marketing that centers on women and acknowledges their limited leisure time. 3 campaigns, to say nothing of the aforementioned knitting machine that never was, are especially relevant to this discussion.
The marketing around the Nintendo DS Lite emphasized its portability and approachability for non-gamers. This was not a console for the hardcore crowd, but rather a new curiosity, complete with the then novel touchscreen. The games that were promoted alongside the DS Lite, namely Brain Age and Nintendogs, especially appealed to women for their low time commitment and easy entry into casual gaming. The Do Something With Your Nothing magazine campaign from Nintendo further highlighted the idea that gaming was a way for women to fill in small gaps of idle time. The 2006 ads for the Nintendo DS Lite, some of which were featured in women's magazines like Oprah Magazine, showed photographs of women in waiting rooms, delighting in their DS while the people around them were obviously bored and envious. The ad reads, "You have time, that nothing time, the time between everything else you have to do. Touch Generations is a series of games that easily get you in, out, and on with the rest of your day. In just a few short minutes, you could make a dent in a Sudoku puzzle or play 3 holes of golf. It's your nothing time. Do something with it." These ads distanced the DS from the overarching gaming culture at the time, which in 2006 was still very much centered around young boys. Brain Age and Nintendogs were anomalies in the market that enticed both girls and adults. Brain Age games, typically titled as Dr. Kawashima's Brain Training outside of the US, were notably marketed not as a video game, but as a test for the age of one's brain and a tool for exercising cognitive function. According to Nintendo in 2006, 44% of DS owners were female, a new gaming demographic that the company continued to address directly, all while artfully dodging the possibly alienating title of gamer. Ready Player 2 mentions this as, quote, "the video game industry that are both inviting in women audiences yet keeping them at bay." During the 2012 launch of the Nintendo 3DS, commercials and magazine ads featured female athletes and celebrities playing games like Brain Age and Art Academy, a Lessons for Everyone game that guides players through sketching and illustration. This Play As You Are campaign had actress Diana Agron look into the camera and clarify, "I'm not a gamer. With my 3DS, I'm an artist." In a similar TV spot, Olympic gold medalist Gabrielle Douglas looked into the camera after playing the new Super Mario Bros. 2 and says, "I'm not a gamer. With my 3DS, I'm a coin collecting champion." Considering marketing strategies like these, there seems to be an implication that women are hesitant or even averse to claiming the title of gamer. In the early aughts and even into the 2010s, the image of a gamer was very much male and typically associated with console or PC gaming.
As you can see, marketing to female gamers comes with inherent controversy. Based on research and studies, women do tend to play games differently than men, often preferring action removed from violence, games that align with their available leisure time, and those that foster productivity. And we must acknowledge that even companies like Nintendo that have managed to effectively market to women are also culpable in using women as props to lure in the male demographic. Perhaps the best example of this is Nintendo's hiring of booth babes at the 2010 E3 conference. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of booth babes, they're exactly what you're probably thinking. Booth babes are attractive, usually scantily clad women hired by gaming companies to model their products and tempt gamers to stop by their booths and test them. The concept is incredibly sexist, to say the least. So much so that they were banned by E3 in 2006. However, there is certainly still a gray area that continues, allowing companies to peddle attractive women without them being relegated booth babe and promptly banned. So how did Nintendo get around this in 2010? At the conference, Nintendo hired women to hold 3DS systems. But here's the twist. These women had the systems strapped to their waists for guests to play. While they were not dressed in bikinis or provocative clothing, the advertisement's provocative nature certainly cannot be ignored, and the message was all too clear. Women are props for male gamers to sexualize and for companies to exploit, even for the family-friendly Nintendo. Nintendo is certainly far from the only company guilty of hypersexualizing women for profit in this way. However, Nintendo certainly did stand out at E3 2010 for this display. It's telling that even in the context of Nintendo's reputation for attracting a more diverse audience, its default marketing still pandered to the male gaze and discounted women as props for men to ogle at, rather than as serious gamers. It's here that we can observe the masculinization of hardcore gaming and the feminization of casual gaming.
So would you say that, because then when I think about mobile games, there's a ton out there that are definitely, those very lush aesthetics, the pink and the sparkles. What is this kind of a difference between console marketing and mobile marketing?
Yeah, I think that in large part, most console makers, I guess I shouldn't say most, I would say like Xbox and PlayStation still largely market to men. I think the Switch tries to be more family friendly or market to women slightly more, whereas everyone nowadays has a smartphone. So that's going to include, middle-aged women who love Candy Crush to young women who might want to try like a dating sim or more narrative focused scroll game on their phone. So I think that that's also part of it, is that if you're marketing to a woman, well, of course, women, including myself, own something like a PS5. There's a lot higher of a chance that you'll capture more of your market if you don't put the sometimes prohibitive barrier of a $500 console in the way and instead put it on mobile for women to play. And you can pretty much safely assume that most women will have it in the United States, have a smartphone.
I thought for a second when you said prohibitive that you were going to say the prohibitive label of like a video game, a gamer. Do you think that maybe is part of it? Is like, this isn't a video game. This is just a game.
Yes, I do think that has an impact for sure. I think that actually goes back to the 90s, right? There's some people who argued that like Barbie Fashion Designer wasn't a video game because it didn't have XYZ, right? When I would argue it absolutely is a video game. But I think that if you're somebody who sits down and plays something on, the Xbox Series X or something like that, you're a lot more likely to call yourself a gamer than someone who maybe plays a mobile game on your commute to work, for example. So I do think that definitely comes into play. I also think about the fact that the largest share of the mobile market is like middle-aged women, to our knowledge. And so I don't think they probably describe themselves as gamers, but they definitely play video games, a lot of them on a daily basis. So I think that we have this pervasive attitude that if you're playing on a PC or you're playing on a console, then you might be a quote unquote real gamer. But if you're just playing mobile games, you're not a real gamer. So I do think that absolutely comes into play too.
According to the Entertainment Software Association's Power of Play 2025 Global Games Report, men and women play video games in approximately equal numbers. 48% of gamers are women and 51% are men. In an interview with GamesIndustry.biz, ESA President Stanley Pierre-Louis further noted that of the 21 countries surveyed, quote, there are more women players than men in 10 of the 21 countries, and 2 more countries have a 50-50 split. When it comes to mobile gaming, Rezvani is entirely correct. Women are far more likely to play on smartphones and tablets. The Power of Play report found that 64% of women indicated that mobile was their preferred device. Men weren't far behind, though, at 46%, demonstrating the increased relevance of mobile gaming in the big picture of the overall gaming market. The average gamer is no longer a 12-year-old boy cleaving to his console. They are a middle-aged adult that is just as likely to play on their smartphone as they are to boot up their Xbox. For reference, the ESA puts the average age of a gamer at 41. And these adult gamers are playing a wide diversity of games, with puzzle games rating most highly with female-identified players at 62%. Puzzle games could encompass anything from Tetris to hidden object games like June's Journey. These are mobile-friendly, which obviously meshes with what Rezvani mentioned earlier. However, as was demonstrated with Nintendo's Play As You Are campaign, there is a persistent belief that women who play video games aren't necessarily gamers. Statistically, women are less likely to claim the title of gamer. The Pew Research Center reported that of the 50% of men surveyed that said that they played video games, 15% agreed that the word gamer described them. Of the 48% of women surveyed who played video games, only 6% identified as gamers. This might come down to the dichotomy between hardcore and casual. Players of games that can be termed as hardcore are more likely to self-identify as gamers. But what are the actual definitions of hardcore and casual in this context? From Danish game designer and researcher Jesper Juhl in his 2010 book, A Casual Revolution, Reinventing Video Games and Their Players, quote, there is an identifiable stereotype of a hardcore player who has a preference for science fiction, zombies, and fantasy fictions, has played a large number of video games, will invest large amounts of time and resources toward playing video games, and enjoys difficult games. The stereotype of a casual player is the inverted image of the hardcore player. This player has a preference for positive and pleasant fictions, has played few video games, is willing to commit little time and few resources toward playing video games, and dislikes difficult games. Cross-referencing these stereotypes with the Share Chess rubric, we can safely infer that while not all casual games are girl games are typically made with casual players in mind. This has been called the feminization of casual in researcher John Vanderhoff's 2013 paper titled Casual Threats: The Feminization of Casual Video Games. Do you think that today the games that are marketed toward women are still trying to be less intensive of leisure time, because the assumption is that we don't have as much leisure time as compared to our male counterparts?
That's an interesting question. I could see that definitely coming into play. I think that there's also an unfortunate extension of the pink tax, if you will, that we see on feminine coded products in general that translates into modern girl games, where you're a lot more likely to get a game with, say, microtransactions. So for example, Infinity Nikki is free to play, but has tons and tons of microtransactions in it. I think that it's definitely continued in this sort of short form, play a little bit on, your commute to work or waiting in the doctor's office or for the dentist or something like that on your phone rather than a handheld now. But I don't necessarily know if the larger, more high production girl games assume that per se anymore, because a lot of it is trying to get you to play as much as possible and spend as much money as possible. But I think that is likely more due to sort of the current state of monetization in the games industry rather than an assumption about leisure time nowadays. But that is a really interesting question. I'll have to think about that a little more too.
The growing cozy genre has found a successful niche in providing relaxing, often domestic and narrative-based experiences to gamers that want to relax. When speaking about the so-called cozy gaming revolution, titles like Animal Crossing: New Horizons and Stardew Valley come to mind, to say nothing of the burgeoning indie scene highlighted by the annual Wholesome Games Direct. Which brings me to a theory that I've been pondering. Are girl games of today just casual games? Are they what social media refers to as cozy games? Like wholesome games? Like the Wholesome Games Direct, which is just highlighting all these indie games that are very cute, very narrative focused. And I was wondering if the idea of like cozy games, would you consider that kind of a rebrand of the girl game that just feels a little bit more maybe accessible to your average CSGO player that's looking for something a little bit more relaxing?
I think that, at least in my mind, the only sort of parallel between a cozy game and a traditional girl game is that both are marketed often to women. But when you look at the actual mechanics and gameplay, they're quite different. So a cozy game might have some of like the same sort of dating elements or maybe some of the narrative elements, but these games are largely about kind of relaxing task completion, right? Like you are figuring out how to grow vegetables on your farm, or you're talking to the townsfolk, or you're catching bugs or fish or things like that. And the setting might change, or the exact way that that mechanic is implemented might differ from game to game. But I think that while they have this sort of cute aesthetic that probably appeals to a lot of girls and women, I think that these games are also maybe a little bit more gender neutral than we might initially expect, even though they are largely played by girls and women, but so too do men. And I think that while they are sort of marketed to both men and women, girl games traditionally have only been marketed to women. And so you see sort of a hyper femininity with girl games that I don't think is part of the DNA of a lot of cozy games, which while may have a largely female player base or might be really cute or might not ask for, twitch reflexes and sort of like fast paced combat or things like that, they do present a sort of femininity that's less like exaggerated and flamboyant and camp as compared to like a girl game.
Daley's theory of cozy games stepping up as a modern example of girl games hinges largely on the approachable, casual nature of these games. But Rezvani points out that femininity, the pink and purple aesthetics we often see in 90s girl games, are part of the equation. We close this episode of the podcast with a discussion. How does Ash Rezvani define a modern girl game? How does Daley define a modern girl game? How do I define a modern girl game? What factors make it difficult to nail down a direct definition of what is a girl game in the first place? Here, we touch more on the difficulties of making games for specific demographics, without wading into the ethical mire of gender stereotypes, hesitance around framing girl games as cozy games, and vice versa, as well as the significant progress that has been made within the gaming industry and the community since the aughts and the 2010s. Our discussion considers the influence of games like Call of Duty, considered a traditional boy game, Hello Kitty Island Adventure, definitely a girl game, and Dead by Daylight, a game that is certainly not pink, but enjoys a majority female player base. We come to a conclusion, not on the precise definition of a girl game, but that video game designers and marketers now recognize that the average gamer is not defined by their age or their gender. The large disappearance of the 90s style girl game from the market is a reflection of the new gender-neutral attitude rising in video games. Now, Player 2 is understood to be interested in much more than just fashion and capable of much more than just tossing marshmallows.
This was a really interesting thought from Ash, because when I was first approaching this kind of theory that I had in my head of cozy games are the modern girl games, I was mostly thinking about how they're more approachable, the fact that you don't need those aforementioned fast twitch reflexes, or even more crucially, significant experience with other games. Like if you're getting into League, it kind of presumes that you already have experience with playing MOBAs. So the so-called hardcore games come with that assumption that this isn't kind of your first rodeo, and that if you're playing these games, you're a gamer, you have experience with other games. Whereas cozy games, you can jump right into any cozy game, and that could be your very first experience with video gaming, and you'd be able to have a pretty good handle on it, I think. So it's interesting to me that Ash emphasized the importance of this hyper-feminine aesthetic rather than what I thought was more definitive of a girl game, which was the casual nature.
Mm-hmm. And that was something we talked about a lot before we even got into this episode of what is the modern girl game. And we both kind of settled on games that are kind of like Stardew Valley, Unpacking, things like that. But based on what Ash said, that's a completely different genre. I guess my concern with that, And I do see where she's coming from, because visually speaking, and in terms of the developer's intent, the girl games of the early 2000s and even before then the 90s, they didn't have so much a narrative. They were based in a lot of stereotypes of the time. Whereas what we define as cozy games today, you can do a lot more in them. They're like set goals, things like that. So they are different. I do understand that. But my concern is really like, if these are separate games, are we accepting that the modern girl game should be defined as kind of shovelware? I hate to put it like that, but kind of shovelware that's mostly dismissed on like mobile devices, or disregarded as something just, to attract whales to buy new outfits for characters on mobile games, or just leaning into hyper feminine stereotypes. Like, does it have to be clad in all pink and purple to be made for girls? And I don't think Ash was saying that necessarily, but that would be my concern in separating these genres, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because going into this, and even with as much research as we've done, we've read books and papers, several hundred pages, I would say, between the two of us. We can't kind of nail down a direct definition of what is a girl game, because there are sides that emphasize the aesthetic and like kind of this pink, bubbly Y2K. You can definitely recognize it when you see it. It's derivative of like the Barbie fashion designer. But then there's others that are like, oh, it could be anything that's got this more casual game loop, that's more narrative focused, that has the social aspects and isn't preoccupied with like violence. And I do agree with you that if we go by kind of like more strict standards of like what a girl game looks like in terms of like comparing it to the 90s dress up games, it does get a little bit into that realm of like shovelware, because Infinity Nikki being the exception, because it's a huge game, but it is primarily about outfits.
Right. So one of our sources that I thought was really particularly interesting is From Barbie to Mortal Kombat, Gender in Computer Games. This is the source, that was written. It was written during the 90s. So I also caution, like, yes, this data is dated, but when we were looking at the context of the girl game made in the 90s and early 2000s, it is really interesting to see how people were defining, games for girls at the time. But they talk about, we have to be cautious about making games specifically for girls and falling into stereotype. And they assert that it's actually harder to make a game for everybody than just a girl game. Many of the developers at the time were less concerned with making games that are interesting and express the desires of young girls in their game, and more so just tapping into an untapped market. Everything comes back to capital for the most part, and there are definitely exceptions to that, Purple Moon being an easy one. But we have changed so much since the 2000s, socially and in the realm of video games. Views on what were inclusive at the time have shifted. So I think with that in mind, we have to look at how the definition of girl game has shifted. To me, the answer is that the girl game isn't expressly made for girls necessarily. It is opened up to be androgynous, more so for everybody. I guess where I'm stuck is that if they aren't expressly just marketed to girls, I guess, does that make it a girl game anymore? Maybe that's what Ash is talking about.
Yeah, the Barbie and Mortal Kombat book, which I love that that's kind of the dichotomy. It's either you have Barbie or you have Mortal Kombat. That went in pretty hardcore into the idea of like there are different gameplay loops that appeal to women as opposed to what appeals to men, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, again, even though this data is what we would call kind of, outdated, when we look at the games of the time, what they found is that what was popular among girls at the time is nonviolence. So you weren't seeing them play, the shooters. And this aligned with girls' trends in watching television and movies as well. So game companies were paying attention to that when they started crafting girl games. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be action in a video game, Brenda Laurel talked in her interview with the National Endowment of the Arts about how, like, one of the developers she spoke to said that, like, they were going to use marshmallows as the player's input. So that would be the action the player takes in the game. And this was for an early attempt by Activision to make a Barbie game in 1987. I'll just read the quote from the article. The designer of that game told me in an interview that the game mechanic was throwing marshmallows at the mall because girls weren't very good at trajectory, and marshmallows moved more slowly. That game sank like a stone. and it reified the folklore about girls and games that had been there since the beginning. So yeah, kind of insane. Side note, have you thrown a marshmallow before? They don't just like...
You can wing that thing.
Yeah, so it's kind of weird. But there is at least some science behind what I would say they failed to convey is that, girls at the time weren't necessarily, trying to button mash and do turbo controls on like a shooter or anything like that. But they did want a game with choices, with gameplay in them. Unfortunately, that kind of surfaced in ways that are controversial. They fall into stereotype and kind of make girls seem as if they are incapable of playing the sorts of games that men like. So it's kind of a slippery slope, and that's very much contentious even today amongst feminists of, well, some girls don't like that type of action, but a lot do. So how do we balance that without falling into just stereotype? That's a question we were asking even back then. What's also interesting is that they found that girls were less likely to engage with PCs or games in general unless they tied back to productivity and were based in reality. They found that girls tend to like stories based on something that they can parallel in their real life, whereas boys are more likely to make like an action fantasy adventure and really relate to that, which I find really interesting because personally, when I played Pretend growing up, I had some really wacky scenarios, like the world is ending. We have to, I don't know, but that was the finding at the time. But also talking about like action within games marketed towards girls is that girls tend to like patterns and rules, whereas boys, especially young boys, are very comfortable with like trial and error play. When you look at like the NES or SNES, Ghosts and Goblins is a really good example. A pretty brutal game. You're going to die like 1,000 times, probably more. And you just kind of have to run head forward into it and learn from trial and error. But girls are more likely to take some time and like think through all the options before running into a situation. And if we look at action games at the time, like that really wasn't the MO. It was very much you're expected to die, go for it. And it kind of reminds me of Barbarian the movie. That's kind of the entire plot. Side note. So I mean that so is to say that, that designation for women being a little slower to think on actions before they just run into a situation is at least, it's very much represented in media today. So the studies are still, I think they're still very relevant. When we put all these pieces together of like what girls like and dislike in games, I think they do apply to the cozy game for sure. A lot of these cozy games, they aren't giving you like instant, you don't have to do an instant action in order to survive. You don't have to, functionally like kill your character a million times just to learn. They're just chill,
Forgiving. Yeah.
They're forgiving. I mean, sometimes online you'll see questions of how is this a game? Why would anyone find this appealing? When you look at something like, I keep going back to Unpacking, but that game is really addictive. And I think it's a really good example of like, why would someone just want to play a game about unpacking? Because it's, you don't have to make instant choices like that. It's based in reality. Like the studies show that a lot of women resonate with. You're going through the story of unpacking and slowly going through the life of this person, It's very emotional. I think these studies definitely hold up, and we can apply them to today's modern girl game and even the cozy games. And if we're separating cozy game versus girl game, we can at least see why so many people identifying as women are gravitating to these cozy games.
Yeah, because if you flip it on its head now in the year 2026, what is a boy game? Are there any games that it's like, no, this is only for boys or only marketed to boys? And I don't think that exists very explicitly anymore as it had in the past when there were, the ads that we talked about previously that were sexualizing women and very much implying that like this is a product. Gaming as a whole is the realm of, older brother rather than younger sister, which it makes it hard to define what a girl game is today. And that's why I lean toward the cozy games, because I'm like, well, that's not intimidating for the female demographic whatsoever. A Harvest Moon game or Animal Crossing is going to be appealing, especially to women, but to everyone as a whole, which I agree, is more difficult to get a game that is going to appeal to everyone. But maybe that was a bigger problem in the past than it is today, now that we have kind of done away with some of the stereotypes that we have. I mean, it's kind of crazy, the things that we looked at, realizing how recently the more egalitarian approach to game marketing is in, the 2020s as compared to even like 2013. Casual games, especially in the 2010s, were like very maligned as like devaluing the gaming community as a whole, and that this was something to be looked down upon rather than like a huge opportunity for more people to get into video games. There was this more gatekeeping attitude that wasn't a good thing. There shouldn't be more people getting into video games, especially the wrong type of people.
Right. It's just so tricky, like you said, especially like if we do separate cozy versus games for girls, part of it rubs me the wrong way, even though I completely understand relegating them each their own genre. Does that mean that inherently we're labeling girl games as lesser? Because quite frankly, you really don't see very many of what would be defined as a traditional girl game that have that effort put into them, that have, I don't want to say good intentions, because I don't know the intentions of the developers, but are made explicitly for the enjoyment of girls rather than just making a quick buck off of them. But then if we do include cozy games, that's where we start to see, I keep going back to Stardew Valley, but that's because it made just such a huge impact. Acclaim. Yes. These games that typically have a female audience now have high acclaim. If we remove that, we lose it. I guess that's my resistance to reframing cozy game as something separate from girl games. But I guess I'm starting to realize how it isn't inherently accurate because it is not just marketed toward women. I mean, Stardew Valley's creator isn't even a woman. I think it's an interesting discussion. How do we even want to categorize these games?
Yeah, it's hard to. It's the way I've started thinking about it is like there's kind of a Venn diagram of girl games and cozy games, and it's almost a circle, almost just a totally overlapping circle. But I do agree with Ash that there's room to be like, Barbie fashion designer isn't necessarily a cozy game. Neither is like, I guess, Dress to Impress off of Roblox, which goes with what you were saying too, is that Dress to Impress was just created by people that were in Roblox creating games. This wasn't some marketing effort by game developers to create a easy touchstone for a modern girl game. You don't see that as much as a whole. I think there is that pivot to what's going to appeal to everyone, but also just happen to be really appealing to women. So it's hard. It's really difficult. I wasn't expecting this to be as difficult as it is to define or to have as many, I guess, a wide swath of opinions about what is a girl game. Is it more based on aesthetic? Is it more based on gameplay? I think both of these are things that you have to weigh in defining a girl game, which is a very gray, vague area we're discovering. We thought it was solid pink, but it's pretty gray, actually.
It's very gray. And I guess you mentioned it earlier, like, what is the modern boy game then? If there are girl games, then what's the boy game? The first thing that comes to mind immediately is Call of Duty. I mean, it doesn't mean women aren't playing it, but marketing-wise, they are absolutely targeting young males. Especially when we look at the ties with the military. And that aligns with, the 90s and 2000s. I mean, in the 90s, Terminator was still extremely popular. And then we look at games like Doom. And in that 80s to 90s era, it was very much action hero, bang, bang, shoot everything you see. And that absolutely is a genre today. Again, it's not that women can't play them. I mean, I played shooters when I was a kid growing up, and they absolutely weren't targeted for me. But the boy game does inherently exist, and there is an inherent sexism in how, boys are marketed to as well. And I guess maybe how I personally can have peace with the fact that the almost regressive kind of stereotyped girl game is still very much in existence and popular today, especially on mobile and places like that, is that there are always going to be developers and people just trying to cash in quickly. We're never going to be fully removed from that in our capitalistic society, unfortunately. But sorry, sad. So maybe less looking at it as, this just affects women, because we have been looking at this mostly from, our experience as women growing up in the gaming industry. But we are still very much regressive in how we are telling men how to play games and that they're inherent killers. And the cozy game maybe is just kind of the middle ground, I guess. Less so than the modern girl game. Maybe we reframe cozy game to be kind of just
gender neutral gaming, which we saw in literature even going back to the 90s, how many games were struggling to be androgynous in who they appealed to. So maybe we can reconcile with that, ? Yeah, maybe in a way we can interpret this as we're going back to the beginning where, like Ash said in her research, board games, which, were the technology of the time in terms of gaming, were very much marketed to the whole family. And I think it's less so necessarily like a family experience, like you're sitting down with mom and dad and siblings, and more today, it's just assumed that the average person is pretty open to the gaming experience. And that could be a mom, that could be dad, that could be a 16-year-old boy, that could be an 8-year-old girl, as long as it's age appropriate, of course. But I think that kind of fits with the overall idea. And also, I think that game developers are very aware that it isn't necessarily children that are playing these games, even if they are appropriate for children. But the ESA did note that the average gamer in, 21 countries that they surveyed, that's going to be around 41 years old. So it's us oldies now that are the primary audience that is actually spending their money, rather than the 14 to 16-year-old boy of the late 90s, early aughts. I think one of the reasons that we've struggled to define a modern girl game is because we don't have a lot of examples off the top of our head. I mentioned earlier Infinity Nikki, because that specifically has the dress up aspects. Your character is essentially a doll that you're dressing up with different outfits, and she has different magical powers based on those outfits. That sounds like a girl game that could have come out of the 90s. The whole Nikki series, I think, are girl games in that sense. I think there is one that we have neglected to mention is Hello Kitty Island Adventure, which I believe started kind of as a joke originally. It was off of South Park. Butters was playing Hello Kitty Island Adventure, and
okay.
Yeah. And originally that wasn't a game. That didn't exist. And now it's out on the Switch, and it is, I would say, Butters obviously is a boy and he can play it, but it does feel very much like a girl game with the soft aesthetics. You're running around on an island doing tasks for Sanrio characters, and Sanrio characters are, I would say, inherently marketed toward young girls. I think they can appeal to anyone, and they certainly appeal to adult women as well, myself included. But I think that in that sense, Hello Kitty Island Adventure is definitely a girl game. It aligns very well with what John Vanderhoff wrote in his 2013 paper, Casual Threats, the Feminization of Casual Video Games. I'm quoting him here. The video game industry treats the term casual as a beneficial target consumer, a potential profit, but this enthusiasm is tempered by subtle devaluation and more blatant feminization of the same market. So girl games and games that are marketed to women can be huge cash cows, as has been, I think, proven time and again. But simultaneously, there's that devaluation and that denigration as like, yeah, but it's a casual game. It's not a real game, or not worthy as the same kind of respect that like a AAA title like a Dark Souls game would.
What's an interesting thought? So when we look at Hello Kitty Island Adventure, it checks all the boxes of what we kind of talked about earlier about what studies showed girls like in video games, at least during, the 90s, early 2000s. It's being marketed directly towards girls. An example of a game that today is very popular amongst women and also members of the LGBTQ community almost has everything that girls were said not to like, and that's Dead by Daylight.
Aha!
Most of the player base is actually women. If you are familiar with Dead by Daylight, there is a lot of fan service. Like a lot. They are very clearly marketing to men. They are inclusive in that there are a lot of female playable characters, both as a villain or as the killer or as a survivor, but they are hypersexualized. If they don't come out looking hypersexualized, you bet you're going to get a million cosmetics that do so. But I wonder, when we look at Dead by Daylight as opposed to, obviously it's wild to compare that in Hello Kitty, but like, it's interesting to see something on the complete opposite side of the spectrum in, a survival horror game that women are the ones primarily gravitating to. I guess a major reason I would theorize is maybe it's not a shooter, but it's a popular collaborative game, which does align with, what studies show that girls like collaborative games where they have to problem solve together, but there's no microphone.
No harassment opportunities, as Shira Tress pointed out.
Yes, and I have to admit, I'm a big horror fan, so the Friday the 13th game, I really liked a lot of the gameplay. Yes, it was very messy, but I stopped playing it because you're functionally forced into playing with the microphones. I mean, even when I was a kid, when I was playing Call of Duty with my cousins online, I always had my mic off. There's no way that I personally wanted to engage with people. That's because personally, I knew that I was going to be harassed just because my voice was feminine. So yeah, they do seem really different, but they do share some aspects that would appeal to women based on these studies.
I think something that's been tempered in me for a long time is that I do not want to interact with other players in a game, even if that game is meant to be collaborative, because of the harassment that's been experienced before or that I've seen other people experience.
No, I mean, even with Animal Crossing and Pokopia, I personally, even with my friends, I kind of just want to be left alone. It's because I don't have a lot of leisure time. It's because I'm overwhelmed at work or something like that. And I kind of use gaming as an experience for just me to relax and be alone with my thoughts in this game. And I think a lot of the games like Pokopia, Hello Kitty Island Adventure, Dead by Daylight allows me to do that because I can just hop in a lobby and there's no expectation of me engaging outside of the game, the gameplay. I don't have to look at the chat. I don't have to do anything.
Yeah, you can get by with emoting at each other quite a bit, right?
I mean, if I'm mad at somebody, I can just block them in if I want to and show my distaste. But JK, I don't do that.
Emily's a toxic gamer, guys.
I'm so toxic. But yeah, I just think it's interesting how games have evolved to become more, the word I'm thinking of is appetizing for girl gamers.
Ooh, delicious. I think overall we are in a much better place for women and marginalized peoples within the industry itself, like the people working in the industry, but also the people that are being marketed to as gamers. There's a better understanding of that person can be, anyone. And I think that's maybe why we don't see girl games as much, is because both in the industry and gamers themselves aren't looking for them, aren't demanding they be made. I think when we see them, it's often a passion project or nostalgia or a remake. It's hard. Some of that, I wanted to say it's kind of a shame to lose that hyper feminine approach to a game, because it's refreshing to see every now and again for sure. But I do think it's a broader reflection of these attitudes toward a gamer can be anyone.
Right. And I think we just need to reiterate, if you are a girl who likes that hyper feminine, just dress up game, that is perfectly fine.
That's great.
The issue is not that, girls like feminine things and activities. The issues are not balance. The industry largely and historically has only represented one type of girl, a hypothetical girl, if you will, tying back to Player 2. The girl that is all in on that genre, doesn't like action games. This hypothetical girl can parallel the interests of some girls, but we need balance in that girls aren't a monolith.
Yeah.
If we want to make accurate games that entice girls to play them, then we need to make a more concerted effort to represent the wants of all girls and all people.
Yeah, I would be really interested in seeing down the line maybe more academic studies that re-examine what are girls looking for in their gameplay? Like, what are boys looking for? Because I don't think it's going to be the exact same as we saw in the Barbie and Mortal Kombat book. I think that we're in a brave new world of gaming that, again, I think is at a much better kind of egalitarian approach as compared to even as recently as, like 2015.
Right. And I guess the last thought I have is like, I think a lot of the progress that has been made in the games industry regarding games that are better reflective of all people is really owed to the indie game scene. Even back in the day with Purple Moon Studios, that was an indie endeavor. And it's one of the only companies that was trying to actively make content for girls in a way that didn't just relegate them to, you want to play dress up, that, wanted to actually show them complex stories. And I think really the most progress is coming from the indie scene. It's not necessarily coming from Nintendo or Xbox or PlayStation, because we now have more tools for creators to make a game and publish it on Steam. We're seeing more voices reflected in the industry. And I hope that we see more of that as gaming becomes even more and more accessible.
I think you said it very well. It's more accessible to be a game designer. You don't have to study at a certain university or go through a certain program. You can just hop on that. And I think that we're getting way more diverse perspectives because there isn't that barrier to entry that there might have been in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised too if we see more what would be defined in the 90s as girl games as part of that kind of indie movement.
Well, Daley, I think we've about covered it.
Yes.
Except that we could write a 90-page thesis on this and still not have tapped into all of the study on, girl games during the 80s and 90s and how they've transformed into today. So this is only a very small discussion in a relatively limitless field of research.
Yeah, don't be surprised if we return to this kind of overall discussion. And I hope, fingers crossed, down the line that we get to talk to more subject matter experts. And we'll always be posting that on our Substack for you to see, along with all of the material that we have referred to here is available for your perusal. Thank you again for listening to Arcade Academia. You can follow us on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook at Arcade Academia. The music track Magic Escape Room by Kevin MacLeod in Computech.com is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0. We'll see you next time.